So we're going to be talking about theories of mass communication. Um, we're going to run through them sort of one by one, but these are a number of attempts to systematically explain why and how people consume media. A lot of this comes from communication studies, but not all of it. And most of these theories we're going to discuss have grown out of effects research, which was discussed earlier in the class. So the first theory I would like to discuss with you is something called the direct effects model. And that's just sort of what it sounds like. It's the idea that media affects us, and those effects appear quickly and are relatively similar across all audience members. And so I chose this picture of some kids watching TV, all kind of huddled around the television there. And if you subscribe to this direct effects model, the idea would be each of these kids is taking in the same information and it's affecting them in the same ways. So kind of a subcategory of the direct effects model is something called the theory of uniform effects. And that's just what I was talking about. It's the idea that there's a uniform effect across people when they consume media. And it's also the idea that media is sort of like a stimulus that evokes a response. So that stimulus response idea that comes from behavioralism in psychology. And again, it's the idea that all individuals who consume a particular form of media, like all these kids around this TV, when they're watching the same TV show, that's the stimulus. And so they're going to be reacting in the same way. So if they, watch something that maybe is designed to provoke anger, each of these kids would feel angry. Or if they watch something that's violent and we believe that what they're watching is going to provoke violence in the kids, each of those kids will get up from the floor and act violently in some way. Okay? Now, the direct effects model, and specifically the theory of uniform effects, is also sometimes called the hypodermic model. And the idea is just like a hypodermic needle. When we consume media, it's like the media messages are getting injected into us. Okay? So just sort of like, the vaccine or whatever goes under our skin and then starts to affect our bodies in certain ways when we watch particular TV shows or movies or play video games. According to the theory of uniform effects or the hypodermic model, that's going to affect us all in the same way. Okay? And I've got some kind of interesting examples of this I wanted to share with you. And some of these are discussed in your book. But the first one I wanted to mention, and I'll show you a clip here in a minute, but it's this movie called Reefer Madness. I don't know if you're familiar with this, or even if you are familiar with the term reefer. In case you're not, reefer refers to marijuana, okay? And this was a movie made quite a few years ago, and it was what was called a cautionary movie. And so supposedly the idea behind making this movie was to let people see what would happen to them if they actually use marijuana. So let's just take a look here at a clip from Reefer Madness.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these. Of course, if you're afraid. That's better. That's more like it. I know you like that. Really, you will. And just take a puff of it.
Right here, to your neighbor. The next tragedy may be that of your daughter, or your son, or yours, or yours, or yours.
So the idea by the original creators of Reefer Madness was this idea of sort of like it's going to be a hypodermic vaccination against people using reefer or marijuana. And, it's really kind of ridiculous because if you're at all familiar, even if you've not done it yourself, but if you're all familiar with the effects of using marijuana, that is not them, right? So, people who use marijuana tend to get kind of relaxed and mellow. They don't shoot people in the back, jump out of windows, and beat people with clubs. Okay. So, but the idea and the reason I bring up that example here is the creators of the movie thought, well, this will be, everybody who watches this will have the same reaction. They'll be afraid to use marijuana. They'll see the negative effects of doing so, and they'll just steer clear of it. Interestingly enough, there's been more, reefer madness has kind of taken off in a lot of ways, recently. And there are a lot of stories about people, current users of reefer or marijuana who enjoy getting high and then watching reefer madness and kind of making fun of how ridiculous it is. Okay. Another example of the theory of uniform effects I wanted to mention to you is, Jerry Falwell and the children's show, The Teletubbies. So you may have heard that name, Jerry Falwell, in reference to Jerry Falwell Jr., who was the president of Liberty University and who left in a scandal. His father, this guy, Jerry Falwell Sr., was a televangelist. He founded Liberty University, Jerry Falwell Sr. And in the 1990s particularly, he was very outspoken about this show, The Teletubbies. And the reason he had so much to say about it was he was particularly taken with this character, whose name, if I remember correctly, was Tinky Wink or Tinky Winky, something like that. And Jerry Falwell's problem with that particular character was he thought it was promoting some kind of gay agenda. So the character, as you see there, I think was male, but frequently carried this bag, which Jerry Falwell thought, looked like a purse and was a feminine thing to do. The character was also purple, which is sometimes identified as a gay pride color. And Jerry Falwell just thought that this was sending the wrong message to young children. And his thinking behind that, he certainly didn't use this term, at least as far as I know, but he was really kind of espousing the theory of uniform effects, that kids will watch this and, I guess be more accepting of homosexuality, or perhaps it might turn them gay. I don't know what he was thinking, but he thought it was a very dangerous thing because it was going to affect, all the kids who watched it very negatively. And I would just like you to think for a minute about whether you think this is how it really works. Do you think that when we consume some media, we all are affected in the same ways? Probably not. I mean, this theory, at least these days, is not really held in much esteem among researchers. It's kind of silly to think that every person who would consume a particular kind of media would be affected in the same ways. We'll talk about another theory later on that indicates that people often do consume media, the same media, for very different reasons. But that's really kind of the opposite of the idea of theory of uniform effects. All right. I'd also like to talk to you about the social learning theory as applied to media. This is something that comes directly from psychology. It has a couple of other names too, including observational learning or modeling. It's the basic idea that we imitate what we see. So sort of like monkey see, monkey do. Those of you who are psychology majors probably know this name, Bandura, and you may be familiar with what became known as the Bobo doll studies. These are studies done on aggression. And basically what Bandura, the researcher who started this line of research, did was have some children watch a film of an adult getting angry. And when this adult would get angry, she would beat up an inflatable Bobo doll. A Bobo doll was an inflatable punching bag, looked like a clown. And then in one condition of his original study, Bandura would put some children into a room with some toys, including a Bobo doll, watch them for a while, and then have someone go in and remove one of their favorite toys that they were enjoying playing with. Presumably, this would make the kids really angry. And the children, many of the children who had seen the film of the adult beating up the Bobo doll, beat up a Bobo doll in the same way. There was another condition of the study in which the kids did not see that film, but all the rest was the same. So they went into a room with a lot of toys, including a Bobo doll. They sent someone in to take away a toy. The kids would get angry, but those kids who had not seen the film of the adult beating up the Bobo doll, although they got angry, they didn't beat up the Bobo doll in the same way that the adult did because they had not seen the movie. Okay, so just to give you an idea of this, in case you've never seen the Bobo doll experiments, that's Bandura. Let's see. Let's start here. This is the film that the children would see of this adult getting mad and beating up Bobo, kicking it, throwing it around. She straddles it at one point, beats it with her fists. Okay, and so this is a boy who saw that film. They took away his toy, and he's mad. And so he's beating up the Bobo doll in much the same way, kicking it like she did, throwing it around like she did. I think you get the idea, right? So, although social learning theory has been applied largely to aggression, it's been applied to other things too. And since, this is a class on mass communication, if we tie all these ideas together, it's the notion that media provides an example for our behavior. So once we observe some behavior in media, we often imitate it. Like I said, that has been applied mostly to violence. So the idea that perhaps children watch a violent movie and then behave in similar ways in their real lives, or they play a violent video game and that may lead them to be more violent in their real lives. But the social learning theory has also been applied to things like sex. So, people watching certain kind of sexual media and then thinking, well, this is how I should behave in sexual behavior in my own life. Or really, a lot of advertising is based on the social learning theory. So, we see these images of how people live in these commercials or whatever, and then we may want to imitate that behavior ourselves in our real lives. Okay. I like to think about whether you think that theory is accurate. Do you think that a lot of media that we consume is a model for our behavior? And I mentioned these examples of violence and advertising and sex, but you can think about social media too. Are social media a good or a place where people see some kind of behavior? They see models for talking a certain way or dressing a certain way, and then they model that behavior. I will tell you that the social learning theory is very popular among researchers today. So there's been a lot of research done in social learning theory, particularly as applied to media. Social learning theory is big in developmental psychology. It's the foundation for a lot of current research within psychology. Okay? So the next theory I would like to discuss with you is something called the cultivation theory. And that may sound a little strange to you. It did to me the first time I learned about it, because when I think about cultivation theory, I don't think about media or cultivation. I think about farming, growing things. Okay. But it's the similar idea, but applied to media consumption. So the cultivation theory is often applied to television. I think it applies to other forms of media as well. But cultivation theory looks at how exposure to TV affects our perceptions of society and reality. So here's a breakdown of how cultivation theory is thought to work. As we know, the goal of TV and most television is a mass audience. People who produce TV want as many eyes watching that programming as possible for advertising revenue and for a lot of other reasons. But cultivation theory next would say that, as so many people are consuming television or a particular form of media, it becomes a shared experience for many people in society. So I think that's true. I mean, even in things like Netflix, people like to discuss, even though there's a lot of shows available on Netflix, people like to discuss what shows they're watching. And if you find somebody who's watching the same shows as you or the same series, or who's watched a recent episode of that series, it's interesting and fun to compare notes. So it's the idea that when media is created, the media sort of media outlets kind of plant a seed, right? And that seed is sort of nurtured or repeated over and over again. So this applies best to news media, this part, the repeated over and over again. So think about some things that you frequently see in the news. One good example might be Trump. So he's in the news almost every day these days. And think about all the images you've seen of him giving a speech somewhere, at some kind of a rally. Those images get repeated over and over again. They become a fixture in our culture. Many people, I think, when they think about President Trump, they think about him, at a podium addressing some kind of an audience. So another piece of the cultivation theory is the idea that media helps define what is important, and then it actually becomes important to people. So the idea is, again, the media plants a seed. So they kind of say, okay, well, here's something we're going to show you again and again that's important. And because it's repeated, those images are repeated over and over again, it actually becomes important, and it sort of grows, right? Just like a seed or a seedling. It grows over time because people are more and more interested in it. Okay. And so another way to think about this is that cultivation theory, and TV in particular, both create and reflect images, opinions, and beliefs. So it's like a back and forth. So again, the media may plant a seed of something that they think is important, or they think we should be paying attention to, and then it actually becomes important, and it grows from there, and we become more and more interested in it, and then more and more coverage of that topic follows from the news media. So a couple of examples that may help you understand this. I think this happens a lot with celebrities and celebrity gossip. So Kim and Kanye might be a good example of this. So, a lot of media, there's a lot of media stories out there about their relationship, Kanye's mental health status, their children, the status of their relationship, all of that stuff. So it's like the media plants a seed. Hey, these are interesting, important people you need to be paying attention to. And then people actually become interested because they're not the norm, right? They don't live the lives that most of us do. So then it starts to grow. Our interest in that starts to grow. And then there's more coverage that follows, right? So now we know where Kanye lives. There are things about Wyoming, like all these things become cultivated and grow over time. Trump is a good example too. I mentioned him earlier, but he's in the news every day. People comment on what he has done or said or tweeted on social media like Twitter. I mean, people comment on the things that he has done. And then news reports, it's interesting because news reports on things that are on Twitter, right? And so hopefully you're starting to see this cycle, right? So the interest is planted, it grows, and then more interest follows, and there's more coverage of the interest. One last example. Many of you are too young to remember or did not live through 9/11, September 11th, 2001, but you've no doubt seen those images of the buildings falling, right? So the planes falling into the buildings and them collapsing. Having lived through all of that and the media coverage of it, I can think of many examples of having seen those images again and again and again, weeks and months after the event actually happened. And it was no doubt a huge story. It changed American way of life in ways we're still experiencing. But the idea, or how this applies to the cultivation theory, is because those images were repeated again and again, they became a shared experience. We actually became even more interested in it because it was on TV all the time. And then there was even more coverage of the events around 9/11. Okay. So one other theory I'd like to discuss with you is called the agenda setting theory. And this is the idea that the media, particularly the news media, creates public awareness and concern for certain issues. It's almost like they make a list or an agenda of things that they think we should be paying attention to. Okay. And in a way, one way you can think about it is agenda setting theory is sort of like half of cultivation theory. So it's like the planting of the seed without the, the nurturing, the cultivating part. But making up a list of things to pay attention to, planting seeds of things to be pay attention to. It's also the idea, agenda setting theory, that the media, especially the news media, tells us not what to think, but what to think about. So the important things we need to be paying attention to. And so if you think about the things that you often see covered heavily in the news, it's often things like politics. I mean, especially lately. So much news about politics, political races, the 2020 presidential race, all of that stuff. The things that Trump says, particularly outrageous things that he says or tweets, is another thing that gets covered a lot. So it's like that's on our agenda. Crime, particularly violent crime, often makes the agenda of the news media. So in thinking about those sorts of things, a question I'd like you to think about too is, so what kinds of things might be important to people's everyday lives, but is not reported that much? Things that could be important to people's everyday lives, but don't get reported on by the news media. Well, here's some possibilities. I'm sure there's others, but I think religion is an interesting one to consider. So, a lot of polls have indicated that, well, if you ask people, Americans, do you believe in God? Something like 70 to 90% of people say that they do. Okay. Something like 50 to 70 to 80% of people say they belong to a church. So clearly in many Americans' lives, religion, spirituality is something that is really important, but you rarely see that covered in the news media, right? There's other things that may not be on the agenda that could be important, like safe sex products, like birth control. Rarely do I see any kind of news coverage of that. Health, that's probably not a good example recently because of the coronavirus epidemic, but just in general, politics seems to get a whole lot more play in the news media than things like personal concerns like health. Okay? So before we move on, I'd just like you to take a moment and think about whether you think agenda setting theory is accurate. Do you think that a lot of media that is created with an agenda? Is the news media particularly telling us what to think about? Okay, one last theory to discuss with you is called uses and gratifications theory. So this theory stresses the role of the audience and the reasons that we use media and what we gain from using media. Some basic assumptions are that people are not passive. Rubin, one scholar who studies uses and gratifications theory, says that when we consume media, we are goal-directed, purposive, and motivated, right? Meaning that we seek out particular media for particular reasons. It's not like we just sit there and let the media wash over us passively. It's also the idea that people take the initiative in selecting and using media to satisfy particular needs. And different people have different needs at different times when they're consuming media. Okay. Sometimes it's to entertain us. Sometimes it's to amuse us. Sometimes it's because we're lonely. And individual differences are very important. So a good example might be a horror movie. Okay. So Get Out. Let's take that one, for example. Some of you may have seen that movie. Really classified as a horror movie, which I guess it is. But, and so some people who watch that might have watched it to be frightened or scared. Some people might have watched it to be amused. There are some comedic elements to that movie. There's also a really strong racial message, to Get Out. So that might have been why some people, tuned in to watch that movie. The idea is, from uses and gratification theory, that we have specific reasons why we use specific media. And it's different for every person. It's different from time to time. You may watch an old TV show you remember from your childhood because you feel like you need comfort, right? You may watch a baseball game because it just relaxes you to watch it. You may take part in social media because you need to kill some time. Every one of us, according to this theory, uses media at different times for different reasons. So I'd like you to think or consider what you think about that theory. This one is one that's usually fairly popular among students, or at least they can see the applications of it pretty readily. So these are the theories we've talked about today. I'd like you to think about, well, and there's others too, I should say. There's some others listed in your textbook. I'd like you to think about just overall which theory you think does the best job of explaining media usage, and in particular, your own media usage.